All right, so we're going to try to grab Russ Baker by phone, and he's going to talk to us. He did a very good book called Family of Secrets about the Bush family, and his work intersects with the assassination stuff that we do, and he continues to do an investigative research project. So I'm just going to have him, speak to you. Or Joe, go. Try to speak, and I'll see if we can hear you.
Here I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is that all right? Everybody who can hear me, raise your hand. I can't see anybody, so I guess nobody can hear me. Can you see me?
We can't see you. We can only hear you, but we are hearing you.
Okay. All right. Well, hello. My name is Russ Baker. I don't know who's there, but just in case you're there, shout out to Linda and Dawn and my other friends. Are either of you there? Linda or Dawn?
Dawn's not here.
Okay.
Not currently.
Okay, anyway, John, thank you for inviting me. I did speak last year. My book is called Family of Secrets. The subtitle is The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. Basically, I was investigating the background to the rise of the Bush family. And in the course of doing that, I discovered there was a whole secret history to that family. Particularly, actually, George W. Bush turned out to have a whole back history that had been entirely missed. He had been involved with a number of companies which appear to have had some sort of an intelligence capacity, as hard as that is to believe about the younger Bush. And in Family of Secrets, I go into all of these strange enterprises with money sloshing in from offshore accounts, people who appear to be representatives of various foreign dictators funding these things and so forth. And then I began looking at the father, George H.W. Bush, discovered, I was sort of curious why Gerald Ford had named him to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1976, at a moment where I'm sure you all know there were the Church Committee hearings, the Fight Committee hearings, and so on. And there was a lot of sort of turmoil over the CIA, and at that very moment, of all the people they could have chosen, they brought in this man, George H.W. Bush, who didn't seem to have any relevant experience or qualifications. And so I was very interested in why that would be. I began digging into his past, and I discovered, lo and behold, he actually was qualified for that position because he had a background in intelligence that had never come out before. He had been using his oil companies and other things he was involved in as essentially cover for intelligence operations, including sighting rigs off of Cuba prior to the Bay of Pigs invasion and employing Cuban exile. So this started getting closer and closer to the JFK material. I was particularly fascinated to find out that in an interview when somebody had thrown this benign softball question to him and asked him just what he remembered about the day Kennedy was shot and any recollections, he sort of froze and claimed he couldn't remember where he was on November 22, 1963. Now, an audience like you, I'm sure, can appreciate how ridiculous that sounds. And, of course, Mr. Bush was about 40 years old at the time. He was a Texan and actually was running for the United States Senate in Texas at the time that Kennedy was shot in Dallas. And so the idea that he couldn't remember seemed preposterous. Well, when I ran across these two declassified FBI documents, one of which showed him to have actually called the FBI on November 22 from Tyler, Texas, identified himself by name and address, and said that he was calling because he had heard that the president had just died and that he had some information on who might have shot him. And he identified a man named Parrott, and James Parrott. And some of this has come out before, but what I do in Family of Secrets is I go much, much further. And so I spent a long time studying that and trying to figure out what was happening there. I have a whole chapter in Family of Secrets just on the Parrott phone call. I won't reiterate all of it because I imagine some of you have read Family of Secrets. But in any case, very clearly he was covering up the fact that he something about this date, something about this event. The other FBI document was one by J. Edgar Hoover where he actually identified Bush as a CIA officer. And I now believe that that was Hoover involved in some very complicated blame game between FBI and CIA, and he wanted to put into government records the fact that Bush was CIA, and the title of the memo references the assassination, and the memo talks about Cuban exiles. And so I think that what Hoover was doing, he was playing hardball with the CIA and saying, I'm going to put out there now in closed government records that can be opened later, which is what happened. George Bush's name, the fact that he was CIA, that he was in Dallas, and that he was connected to Cuban exiles. I now see that memo as a kind of a smoking gun, very, very crucial. The other memo, which identifies him claiming to be a private citizen, and knowing something about who might have shot the president, of course, is enormously important. It's also enormously important that that call was a red herring, that the man, he said, might have been involved in shooting the president. He said, I don't know that much about this man. I've just heard that he had perhaps been a threat, that he actually knew this man very well. And in Family and Secrets, I go through their whole relationship, and the fact that not only did he know this man well because he was a volunteer at Bush's Harris County Republican headquarters, but that he actually, at the very moment that he was ratting this man out, Bush's own assistant, who I interviewed, who was still around, that he was at the home of this James Parrott, basically providing him with an alibi. So Bush is ratting out this man. Bush's assistant is providing the man with an alibi. It was, I now believe, an alibi circle. In other words, the purpose of the call was not really to rat the man out. That was an excuse to get into the government records that George H.W. Bush was calling to be helpful, but more importantly, that he was calling from Tyler, Texas, i.e., he was calling from somewhere other than Dallas. And then he states in this phone call that he is going to travel to Dallas and to stay at the Sheraton Hotel. But what he actually is confusing people with is the fact that he had already been in Dallas and that he had already stayed at the Sheraton Hotel. And so so this is very, very significant. Oh, I'm sorry, hold on just a second here. Sorry about that. I'm at dinner party. Okay. Anyway, so this is very, very significant because you wouldn't make all of these phone calls and you wouldn't try to confuse people unless you were trying to cover something up. I then became very, very interested in the fact that George H.W. Bush knew a man named George DeMorenshield, and I assume that everybody there knows who he is, who he was, and that he was probably the key figure in the life of Lee Harvey Oswald in the year prior to the assassination. He was, many people now think he was his CIA handler. The fact that Mr. Bush knew and was a personal friend of Oswald's CIA handler is not, I believe, insignificant. The fact that he'd known him for decades. And so there are many, many elements that, and I don't consider myself a Kennedy assassination expert, by the way. I'm an investigative reporter. I was just collecting facts and trying to establish some sort of a fact trail. There are many other things. We don't have time to go into all of them, but just one other I'd like to mention. I became very interested in the Texas school book Depository because I'd never heard that term before. And so I thought, well, what is a school book depository? I then began collecting all these books of the Kennedy assassination, and I looked for the answer. And I couldn't find it, and I was sort of struck that there were all these hundreds or maybe even thousands of books, and very few people seemed to focus on the company and the building itself. And what I was interested in was the fact that it turned out that the Texas School Book Depository was not a building, it was a company. And that building itself was largely empty until a short time before Oswald was brought into the building. In other words, the man who owned the building made a deal essentially with a company called the Texas School Book Depository, which had ample officing and warehousing space nearby. There was no reason for them to move into the building at all. They moved a small skeleton staff, and I now believe that that was cover as an excuse to put Oswald in there. And so you can see here the makings of a very large and sophisticated operation. I have since done more research on the Texas School Book Depository Company. The people who ran it seem to have fairly deep military connections. There are also some individuals who worked for the depository company after the assassination, even years later, and they were constantly being hounded by CIA and FBI people in some kind of weird cat and mouse game. It's just incredibly layered, and I just think a lot more research needs to be done. As I do my other work, I on the side continue to do research in that. I'd love to hear from anyone who has an interest in this and maybe knows some more pieces. By the way, we have a website. It's a nonprofit investigative reporting site. It's called whowhatwhy.com. We are dedicated to running several different tracks. One is to continue doing important investigative reporting on historical events, and the other is to apply the same rigor and high standards and precision to investigating things that are going on right now. We're very, very interested in this sort of notion of a kind of a permanent government of the elements in the Pentagon, in the national security state that do not change when we change presidents, and how these elements influence who becomes president, what they do when they're president, how long they stay in the presidency, and so on. Shall I take a few questions, perhaps?
Yeah, we can do that. I'll try to repeat the question from here, and then you can answer it.
Okay, and by the way, I should say that Family of Secrets not only has, I think it's 4 or 5 chapters of largely new material related to the Kennedy assassination. It also has 3 chapters of new information related to Richard Nixon, and you can see the linkage between the removal of Kennedy violently with the removal of Richard Nixon non-violently, that all the same players are involved. All of these figures who were the burglars in Watergate are the same figures who knew Nixon from Operation 40, and then continuing through a whole lot of different kinds of operations, including counterinsurgency operations and assassinations in Vietnam. I also placed H.W. Bush there with a CIA officer where they're there supposedly on congressional business inspecting these same programs. So a lot of continuity from one administration to another. I even see it in keeping Jimmy Carter to one term, putting Jerry Ford in. You see what really looks a lot like a kind of a rolling coup d'etat where people have sort of permanent stakes, and I think a lot of them are people who are not in the government. I think they're basically what you might call the American oligarchy. They're powerful and wealthy individuals who are used to throwing their weight around, and they're used to getting their way. And I think that a lot of these agencies ultimately, in a kind of an informal structure, end up answering to people who we have no idea who they are, and they're not in the government at all.
Okay, anyone have a question? Ed?
What did he make up? Diogenio wrote a scathing criticism of his book. What is his take on that?
Jim Diogenio wrote a scathing criticism of your book. What is your take on it?
You know, I don't know him, but that was one of the dumbest things I've ever read. I mean, it was laughable. You know, here's a guy who claims he knows a lot about the Kennedy assassination. I've got 4 chapters of new material. He ignores almost all of it. And as I remember, he sort of criticizes the book because I cited something that one author had written somewhere, and half his review is blaming me for the fact that he doesn't like this other man who I have nothing to do with, and the other half is complaining that I didn't fill up the book with stuff that had already been published elsewhere on things like Iran-Contra. I mean, that wasn't the point of the book. The point of the book was to break new ground. I did, and it would make sense for reviewers to focus on the new material.
Yeah?
What does Russ know about Jack Crichton asking for Ilya Mammadov?
Do you know anything about Jack Crichton and a relation to Ilya Mammadov?
Yes, in fact, I spent more than a year investigating Jack Crichton. And in Family of Secrets, I have a lot of information on him. Jack Crichton was running an important oil intelligence operation. He was also running a secretive military intelligence unit in Dallas that was connected into the Dallas Police Department. As I reported in Family of Secrets, something like, I think it was 60 Dallas police officers were also simultaneously members of this secretive unit. That's very important. I don't know if that's been reported anywhere before. Jack Crichton was also running an underground communications bunker below Fair Park where the museum was. He had a capacity to actually handle communications that day that could have been crucial in the whole operation. And he knew Mammontov very well. He was instrumental. Crichton was a key figure in getting and controlling who the translators were who got to Marina Oswald and then basically manipulated what she said to try and point the finger of guilt at Lee Oswald. So Crichton is an enormously important figure. He was connected to George de Mohrenschildt. He was directly connected to H.W. Bush because at the time of the assassination, H.W. Bush was on his way to becoming the Republican nominee for the United States Senate, and Jack Crichton was becoming the Republican nominee for governor. They both knew each other. They'd been recruited by the head of the Texas Republican Party. It later came out, although this is not well known, that man, his family foundation was actually a CIA funding conduit. So I think you can see the whole operation right there. You can see they're using this man for the money to flow through. He then basically, essentially is sort of the paymaster for Bush and for Crichton, who were both directly involved in this operation. People who forced their way into the lead car of the motorcade were directly connected with Crichton and his unit. Just one thing after another, you see these two men directly and deeply involved. There also is this allegation from the former head of Cuban military intelligence that both Crichton and Bush were officially, deputized to be part of this operation.
I had a question. Did you look at all of the role of George H.W. Bush on March 31, 1981, the day that Reagan is shot?
I didn't, and all I can tell you is I spent 5 years on Family of Secrets, and I sort of just ran out of time. That obviously is a natural one to look at. It is very, very interesting that obviously that John Hinckley, I did look at it somewhat. I established to my satisfaction that the Hinckley family, which was very prominent in the oil business in Midland, as were the Bushes, that they knew the Bushes very, very well. They even shared an attorney. And it is very curious that the troubled son of the Hinckley family, who were so close with the Bushes, that he should be the one to shoot Ronald Reagan, which of course, had Reagan died, would have made George H.W. Bush president. George H.W. Bush, of course, had run against Ronald Reagan for the presidency, been beaten, and then put on the ticket something itself that was never properly explained. And then Bush's campaign manager, Jim Baker, becomes Reagan's manager. Very odd. I've never seen that pattern before in history. So that whole story, I think, deserves much more attention.
Any other? Okay, I'm going to ask everybody not to raise their hand, but to clap two of them together if they like to. Thanks for being with us, Russ. We'll stay in touch. Okay.